Another polygamous cult based in Salt Lake City. Who'd have thought this would happen? I did. I knew. Because late one winter afternoon in Salt Lake City, a group of young women filed quietly into the federal courthouse. Each carried the weight of a secretive past, ready to unveil it under the harsh light of the law. They were former members of the Kingston Group, a reclusive polygamous sect known as the Davis County Cooperative Society. Yeah, that's quite the long name. They really wanted to sound official. But they also like to call themselves the Order. In a lawsuit filed that day, 10 women accused their one time community of operating as a criminal enterprise, alleging decades of child labor SA, forced underage marriages, and human trafficking beneath the guise of a religious society. It was a moment of reckoning that had been generations in the making. One plaintiff remembered how, at 7 years old, he was put to work on an order owned farm for a few dollars a day. By age 12, he toiled in an isolated mine for 12-hour shifts. Another young woman recounted being assigned in her early teens to print wedding announcements for child brides because wedding pictures of little girls marrying men in incestuous or plural marriages would not be printed at Walmart, as her complaint dryly noted. A third survivor described being coerced at 16 into marrying her 19-year-old uncle as his third wife in an incestuous union arranged to keep their family bloodline pure. These stories were once guarded behind closed doors, but now they're part of public record. Explicit allegations of incestuous underage marriages, our word intended to force teen brides into pregnancy, years of unpaid child labor, and a systemic effort to breed and control a new generation. And today, we are going to try to pack generations of terrible information into one long video. So grab a snack, grab something to sip on, sit back and relax and take a deep breath. It's time to let the fresh air in. Hello, everyone. Welcome back, or welcome if you're new. My name is Erin, and I am fascinated by all things cults, true crime, and unique spiritual practices. I post around 3 videos every single week with some bonus episodes on one of these topics. So if you are interested in this sort of thing, please consider subscribing. I'd absolutely love to have you here. And now, through the holidays, I am sponsoring single parents on my channel. If you are a single parent struggling this year, create an Amazon wish list and email it to me with a little bit about yourself to letfresherin@gmail.com, and I will feature your story and your family in one of my videos, and maybe the wonderful subscribers we have here will be able to help purchase an item for your children. And it doesn't just have to be clothes. It could be coats, food, gift cards to the grocery store, whatever you need to make life a little bit easier this holiday season. Now, without further ado, let's jump into this twisted story. So, for those unfamiliar with Utah's secretive polygamous enclaves, the revelations that came out of this story have been shocking. But for historians and survivors, they echo a dark refrain that has been heard before, because more than 2 decades earlier, before the claim that I discussed in my intro, the year's 1998, and a sobbing 16-year-old Kingston girl named Mary Ann had staggered into a Nevada truck stop, bruised and desperate, and called 911. She told police how her father had forced her to become the 15th wife of her own uncle, and how when she tried to escape, her father dragged her to a barn and beat her unconscious with a belt. Mary Ann's courageous testimony in court a year later pulled back the curtain on a hidden world of indentured barbarism, as one journalist called it. Her uncle, David Ortell Kingston, was convicted of incest and unlawful sexual conduct and sent to prison. Her father, John Daniel Kingston, pleaded guilty to child abuse for the brutal whipping he'd given her and served just a short jail term. At the time, Utah authorities were reluctant to even utter the word polygamy in court. The judge insisted the trial was not about polygamy at all, but the sordid details of that case nevertheless thrust the Kingston Group's insular empire into public view. Now, a generation later, the Kingston Group faces an unprecedented legal assault from within. In 2024, a sweeping federal racketeering or RICO lawsuit accused the sex leaders of decades of organized exploitation. By early this year, yet another young woman, barely 20 years old, filed her own federal suit recounting how she had been brainwashed and coerced into becoming an underage bride to her uncle. This is so recent and modern, it is horrifying. Major media outlets from The Guardian to local Utah newscasts now carry headlines about the group's alleged crimes. Lawmakers in Utah have raced to tighten marriage laws in response, and a former Kingston member turned whistleblower, Mary Nelson, has helped federal investigators unravel a $500 million fraud scheme tied to the sect's financial dealings. So, what was once Utah's open secret, a wealthy, homegrown, polygamous clan quietly thriving on the margins of mainstream society, is now the subject of intense public scrutiny. So, how did the Kingston Group come to wield such power in the shadows? To understand this sect and its inner workings, one must delve into its origins in the aftermath of Mormonism's polygamy ban, explore the secretive family doctrines that sanctify, quote, pure Kingston blood, and hear the voices of those who escaped the sect's tight grip. To trace the Kingston Group's roots, one must travel back to the earliest 20th century, when polygamy had been driven underground in Utah. In 1890, under the pressure from the United States government, the mainstream Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints formally renounced the practice of plural marriage. Utah outlawed polygamy as a condition of statehood in 1896, and by the 1930s, authorities periodically raided communities suspected of harboring polygamous families. Yet rather than disappearing, polygamy persisted among devout splinter groups who believed the LDS Church had sacrificed a divine principle for political expediency. These dissidents, the Mormon fundamentalists, quietly kept the principle alive, convinced they were the true torchbearers of their pioneer ancestors past. One of these believers was Charles W. Kingston, a Utah man with 3 wives who embraced stories that the LDS leadership had secretly allowed a chosen few to continue plural marriage after 1890. In the early 1930s, Charles Kingston and others were inspired by the claims of Lauren C. Woolley, a colorful figure in Mormon fundamentalist lore who alleged that LDS President John Taylor had set apart a circle of men in 1866 to perpetuate polygamy. Charles's eldest son, Charles Elden Kingston, his eldest son, Charles Elden. How did you know he's the eldest son? Well, his middle name is Elden, just in case anyone was worried that they wouldn't be able to know he was the eldest son. So they also called him Elden. He didn't go by Charles, he went by Elden. Just to remind everybody, you guys, I'm the eldest son. And he emerged as an ardent follower of these ideas. By 1935, at just 25 years old, Elden decided to form a community of his own. On January 1st, 1935, in Bountiful, Utah, he established the Davis County Cooperative Society, a group dedicated to united efforts, shared property, and the open practice of plural marriage. Elden Kingston's vision was bold. He aimed to recreate something akin to the 19th century Mormon United Order, a form of Christian communalism where members consecrate all their property to the church. In the Kingston version, families would pool their resources under a cooperative and live frugally, reinvesting any profits to build a self-sufficient community. In those early days, the Kingston members even adopted a distinctive uniform. Simple blue denim outfits with no pockets, symbolizing their renunciation of worldly possessions. Men and boys wore blue coverall suits tied with strings, and women and girls donned plain long blue dresses, a stark visual marker of their separation from the outside world. Though the Blue Coats practice was discontinued by the 1940s as the group grew and sought less public attention, it did set the tone for the Kingston Group's culture of obedience and austerity. Under Elden's leadership, the co op, as members called the society, attracted several dozens of families, many of whom were interrelated. Polygamy was not just encouraged, but practically expected of those, quote, living the principle. Elden himself took multiple wives in line with fundamentalist beliefs. And in the broader landscape of Mormon offshoots, the Kingstons remained a relatively small faction. By the late 1930s, they were one of a patchwork of polygamous clans in Utah, alongside others like the Jeffs clan in Short Creek, today's FLDS Church, and the All Red group in northern Utah. But one thing set the Kingstons apart early on. They pursued an almost business like approach to polygamy, emphasizing economic productivity and the accumulation of wealth for the collective. As one observer later noted, Eldon Kingston's financially expansive agenda would come to define the Davis County Cooperative Society's evolution. Eldon Kingston led the group until his premature death in 1948, just 13 years after its founding. Control would then pass to his younger brother, John Ortel Kingston, often called Ortel, who would guide the sect for nearly 4 decades, from 1948 to 1987. J. Ortel Kingston was a shrewd, tight-lipped man who lived surprisingly modestly for someone who quietly amassed a fortune. He resided in a simple one-story clapboard house in Salt Lake City until his death in 1987. He lived here even as the empire he built around him grew larger than ever. Under Ortel's reign, the Kingston Group greatly expanded its financial holdings and its secrecy. He incorporated new businesses, snapped up land, and aggressively built a church within a corporation, blending faith and finance. To outsiders, the co op was a mysterious enterprise. But to insiders, it was a religious duty to build up the kingdom of God on earth, which in practice meant growing the clan's business and assets. It was also under Ortel that a unique and troubling doctrine appeared to take root in the Kingston Group, a focus on keeping their bloodlines pure. The Kingstons had always preferred intragroup marriages to ensure new generations stayed within the fold. But over time, as the community remained relatively insular, intermarriage among relatives became increasingly common. By the 70s and 80s, marriages between cousins and even half siblings were occurring with some regularity, according to former members and even court records. The justification given was often couched in religious language. Kingston leaders privately taught that their family line descended from righteous, even divine ancestry. Some claimed the Kingston bloodline could be traced directly back to Jesus Christ. Yeah, because Jesus Christ was marrying his brothers and sisters. Marrying within that elect lineage was seen as a way to preserve a sacred bloodline and create a royal generation to lead during the end times. Quote, the order teaches members that only those with pure Kingston blood will survive the coming apocalypse, unquote. That's what one recent lawsuit explained. The Kingston Group's current leader, Paul Elden Kingston, another Elden, is a direct nephew of Ortel and a son of the founding family. Paul Kingston took over after Ortel's death in 1987 and continues to head the organization to this day. Known by the lofty title, the Man in the Watchtower, among followers, Paul Kingston is believed to have more than 30 wives and dozens of children. Many of Paul's siblings, cousins, and extended relatives also hold influential positions within the co op's religious and business hierarchy. In effect, the Kingston clan itself, an interconnected web of fathers, mothers, brothers, sisters, aunts, uncles, and innumerable children, is the church. I just find this so horrifyingly disgusting. It's disgusting. Now, while the group prefers to style itself the high sounding name like the Latter day Church of Christ or Davis County Cooperative Society, which is its legal corporate name, Former insiders say the reality is much simpler. The Kingstons run a family business, and that business is polygamy. Yet the Kingstons' brand of polygamy was never merely about having religious plural wives for personal salvation. From the start, it carried an undercurrent of calculated strategy. Every marriage that could bind two important families together tightened the leadership's control, and every sacrifice, be it a teenager's freedom to choose her spouse or a family's independent income, was framed as a holy offering to the collective good. The outside world knew little of these inner dynamics for much of the 20th century. Kingston leaders cultivated a low profile, teaching members to blend in and avoid the spotlight. And indeed, for decades, no Kingston leader faced major legal consequences for practicing polygamy or taking advantage of the financial aspect of this religious business. Utah authorities, often themselves descended from historical polygamists, were reluctant to prosecute consensual plural marriage because they were boinking around the whole town too. No one has been prosecuted for polygamy in Utah for nearly 50 years, according to the Los Angeles Times. Law enforcement intended to intervene only in extreme cases like incest or abuse, and even then, those cases were rare because victims were just so isolated. As one Utah sheriff's deputy observed, if you don't have a victim, you don't have a crime. A child doesn't necessarily know they're a victim, especially if they are born into a cult. Hello, what's going on? So, for much of the 20th century, the Kingston's parallel society grew in the shadows, marrying, multiplying, and making money largely unchecked. By the 90s, however, the cracks in the facade were beginning to show. Dissenters and survivors started to speak up, and Utah's oldest ghost, as some called polygamy, would soon haunt the headlines once again. But before we explore those turning points, it's important to understand what daily life inside the Kingston Group looks like and why it's been so hard for members, especially women and children, to break. On the surface, life in the Kingston Group might not appear dramatically different from that of many tight knit religious communities. Members typically live in ordinary houses scattered around Salt Lake City and in rural pockets of Utah and neighboring states. They attend church services on Sunday, send their children to school, operate businesses, and shop at community owned stores. But beneath this veneer of normalcy lies a regimented, insular world controlled by the Kingston family's strict rules and teachings. Former members often describe growing up in the order as living in a kind of parallel reality where obedience is absolute. Contact with outsiders is tightly managed, and every major life decision is guided by the will of the leaders. Marriage is the defining event in an order member's life, especially for girls. It happens early, very early. You're just supposed to get married as young as you can, says Jessica Kingston, who was born into the clan in the 90s. Jessica didn't initially plan to become a polygamous wife at all, but she knew that if she remained unmarried past her teens, Kingston leaders might force her into a plural marriage with a man much older than her. So at 16, Jessica consented to marry a young man from another prominent Kingston family, a first cousin of hers. By 18, she was already pregnant with her first child, and within 4 years, she had 4 children in quick succession. Looking back, Jessica says that she felt intense pressure from her parents and the church elders to go through with this wedding at 16. She says most of the time, the girl's only choice is to have babies because that's how we build the order. Most of the time, the girl's only choice is to have babies because that's how we build the order by population, explains Chanel DeRue, another former Kingston member who escaped an underage marriage. In their community, a girl who waited until 19 or 20 to marry was an anomaly. Many were wed at 15, 16, or 17, often to fellow Kingston boys or men who were close relatives. Courtship, as it might be called elsewhere, is a curtailed affair in the Kingston world. While the group officially preaches free agency, and I think if any group has to preach free agency, they probably don't actually have free agency, but they would claim that all marriages are the individual's choice. But the reality, as I'm sure you could guess, is far more coercive. The community holds monthly youth dances and social events ostensibly to let young people meet and fall in love. But according to multiple survivors, these dances often serve a more transactional purpose. If attraction isn't sparked at dances, leaders of the group act as matchmakers in setting up pairings, one insider told a reporter. Behind closed doors, Kingston parents, especially the fathers, will counsel their teenage daughters on whom they should marry, typically suggesting a short list of approved young men, usually relatives who are deemed worthy. In some cases, leadership directly arranges marriages to strengthen alliances or preserve bloodlines. The concept of pure Kingston blood looms large. Marrying an outsider is strongly discouraged. Marrying a relative is often seen as preferable since it keeps wealth and heritage in the family. So, indeed, incestuous unions, uncles marrying nieces, first cousins marrying each other, half siblings intermarrying, have all been documented within the Kingston Group for decades. In one notorious case from the early 90s, Jason Kingston, a member of the clan, impregnated his half sister, Andrea Johnson, when she was in her early 20s. Andrea tragically died from complications after giving birth, amid allegations that the family delayed getting her medical help to try to hide the incest. Another Kingston man, Jeremy Kingston, went to jail in 2004 for taking his 15-year-old cousin, who was simultaneously his wife by polygamous family ties, as a fourth wife. And of course, the David and Mary Ann Kingston case in 1998 exposed that a 16-year-old girl was married to her 33-year-old uncle and that he already had 14 other wives, including at least one half-sister and another niece by that time. Why would so many in the community go along with such marriages? Well, the answer lies in the deep indoctrination from childhood. From their earliest memories, the 2024 lawsuit states, Kingston children, especially girls, are taught to fear outsiders and to accept the order's marriage practices as God's will. One vivid example of this indoctrination was recalled by Jessica Christensen, a former Kingston member who later became one of the protagonists of the reality TV series Escaping Polygamy. She remembers a Sunday school lesson in which a teacher performed a striking demonstration. The teacher held up a clear bucket of water, then added a vial of black dye. As the inky blackness spread through the water, the children were told that this is what happens when you mix with those outside your race. You become tainted and you can never be pure again. So we're just going to throw some white supremacy in there too. Holy bleep. The message was unmistakable. Marry within your community and implicitly within your white Anglo-Saxon bloodline, or face spiritual contamination. The Southern Poverty Law Center, noting accounts like this, has bluntly labeled the Kingston clan a hate group, citing its white supremacist and racist teachings mixed within religious doctrine. Kingston leaders like to deny harboring racist beliefs. They're just like, no, I want to my cousin, guys. It's not racist to want to your cousin. Give me a break. They insist that it's just doctrine, it's just a lesson. But many ex-members confirm that not mixing your blood was a core emphasis in Kingston sermons and at home lessons. Inside the Kingston Group, women and girls have a sharply circumscribed role. They are groomed to be obedient wives and prolific mothers, nothing more. The girl's only choice is to have babies, says Chanel Deroux. A Kingston woman typically will have a child roughly once a year during her fertile years. It's common for women to bear 10, 12, or even 16 or more children. 16 children. You're pregnant for like fifth, fourth of your life? Mary Ann Kingston's father, John Daniel, for example, was said to have around 20 wives and over 100 children by some estimates. Mary Ann's mother was actually John Daniel's half-sister, illustrating how tangled the family tree can actually become. Another former member, Mary Nelson, notes that her own mother was the fifth of her father's 18 wives and also his half-sibling. In Mary's household, her mother was largely left to fend for 15 children with minimal support. The father brought dinner or groceries on occasion. Awesome! But otherwise, the wives were expected to raise their many children almost single-handedly. What a beautiful family picture that paints. Men, meanwhile, hold all formal power in the order patriarchal system. The law of one above another is preached. This means that every woman is under the stewardship of a man. First, it's her father, and then it's her husband. And ultimately, all men answer to the higher ranking men above them, all the way up to Paul Kingston at the very, very top. Kingston men are expected to be providers and, if deemed faithful and well connected enough, polygamous husbands to multiple wives. But not every man in the group gets to practice polygamy. There is an unstated hierarchy. As one former member observed, there is an inner circle of elite Kingston families whose sons are entitled to more wives and better jobs within the community. The less pedigreed or the less favored men might only have one wife, boo hoo, or they might not even have a wife at all, while the men in the Kingston bloodline could accumulate dozens. This has the effect of concentrating both genealogy and loyalty around the core Kingston males. It also creates a surplus of young men with slim marriage prospects, which is a dynamic very common in polygamous societies. Though in the Kingstons' case, many of those young men are kept busy working in the group businesses, and any who rebel are just cast out quickly. From early childhood, Kingston kids are immersed in this reality. Their education is often cut short or tightly controlled. In theory, Kingston children have been allowed to attend public schools, and in recent years, many go to the group's own charter school, Vanguard Academy. But ex members say that formal education is not prioritized, especially for the girls. Jessica Christensen recalls that as a child, she was denied an education and instructed by her father to work for Kingston polygamy businesses instead. Jessica loved learning, but that didn't matter. Her labor was more valuable to the family. When she realized as a young teen that her future would be to become a child bride like her mother had been, Jessica mustered up the courage to run away from the order entirely. Her escape was rare. Most Kingston youth simply complied with their expected path. Start working in the family businesses as a kid, marry in your mid teens, then churn out children while remaining utterly subservient to the community's male leadership. Many businesses, schools, and residences connected to the Kingston Group or the Order are spread across the suburbs of Utah's capital, blending into the surrounding community. Life within the Kingston enclave is designed to be all encompassing. Quote, the Order tries to provide everything that you could ever need to interact in your daily life, unquote. The Kingstons operate their own grocery stores, gas stations, construction companies, restaurants, mines, and even a credit union or central bank where members deposit their money. As Mary describes it, they didn't let us really interact with the outside world because they were scared that we would see behind all their lies, see how things really work in the world. And this strategy is effective. If your church is your employer, your landlord, your banker, and your educator, leaving it means losing everything overnight. Members are constantly reminded of that. Mary Nelson recalls, they threaten you and say, if you leave, we're going to take all your kids and we're going to take your house and we're going to take your car and you won't have anything, unquote. In the Order, that's not an idle threat. It's literally true because the Order owns nearly all the assets. From a young age, Kingston members are conditioned to consecrate their earnings and property to the cooperative. This means that while a man might be listed as the owner of a home or a business on paper, in practice, he is expected to treat it as the group's property, subject to directives of Kingston leadership. Many members formally sign over deeds or paychecks to the Davis County Cooperative Society, and in return, the co op will provide for basic needs, but often just barely. And indeed, Kingston companies and houses are typically registered under obscure corporate entities or trusts, not individual family surnames. This makes it very difficult for outsiders to track the full scope of the sect's wealth and ensure that a defector leaves empty handed. One striking anecdote during his incest trial, David Ortel Kingston, the uncle who married Mary Ann, was asked to list his personal assets and liabilities. He recorded 0 on every line. No debts, but also no property, no income, no bank accounts, nothing. This was a man who helped manage a 150 million plus family enterprise. Yet financially, he owned nothing. The cooperative system is designed that way. Work assignments in the Kingston Group often start absurdly early in life. 9 of the 10 plaintiffs in the 2024 lawsuit say they began working full or part time in elementary school or even in preschool. Some recall being pulled out of normal classes to do manual labor or clerical tasks for Kingston businesses. Pay, if any, was token. One former order member says the standard practice was to start wives and children at 10 cents an hour. 10 cents an hour. And eventually rise them up to minimum wage. Well, on paper, at least. They're pretty clever, a source told the Salt Lake Observer. Everybody in the organization works for really low wages. By keeping labor costs within the family so low, the Kingston enterprises could grow and profit enormously. But the families themselves saw little of that wealth. Despite the numerous sources of income, the families carry out an austere existence that sometimes borders on poverty, the same source said. Men might have access to cash from the cooperative's central coffers to splurge on personal hobbies or tech gadgets, for instance, as Mary Nelson noted of her father, but women and children often lived on very tight budgets, even as they worked really long hours. For example, Amanda Ray Grant, a Kingston daughter, says that she was assigned as a young teen to work at a printing shop, Advanced Copy, specifically to handle the community's wedding invitations, a job no outsider could do, giving the quote, wedding pictures of little girls that needed to be printed. Another child, Jeremy Roberts, was put to farm work at age 7 or 8 for $3.23 an hour. And by 12, he was laboring in a coal mine run by the order, and he would endure grueling shifts. The Kingstons officially deny using underage labor, but such denials ring hollow against the consistency of firsthand accounts. Notably, in 2022, the U.S. Department of Labor actually cited a Kingston owned company, Standard Restaurant Supply, after investigators found that minors, likely Kingston teens, were working illegally at the business. So, to the outside world, the Kingston family presented itself as a devout, tight knit religious community that values family, education, and self sufficiency. They emphasize that every child is a priceless blessing, and indeed, children are everywhere in ordered communities, noisy packs of siblings playing in the yards of large multifamily homes. Current spokesmen insist that marriages are a personal choice, and they claim that underage marriage is against official policy. I'm sure it is. They tout statistics of dubious credibility, claiming that over 94% of their members who married as minors in the past 20 years still earned a high school degree, and a third, mostly women, even graduated college. But in reality, such rosy outcomes are not reflected in the stories that survivors tell. Leaving the order is immensely difficult because it means unlearning a lifetime of conditioning. Quote, I feel like my mind is an onion, says Mary Nelson. The longer I'm away from the order, it's peeling back layers I didn't think was ever possible for me to be outside. I didn't understand how people lived, unquote. Her epiphany after escape was realizing that everything she'd been taught, that outsiders were evil, that one's worth was in blind obedience, that women must submit to abuse, it was all a lie. And for most people in the cult, that realization never comes. Generations of Kingstons have known no other life. As Mary Nelson puts it, referring to the women in the group, they don't have any idea they're being controlled. That's the way they were taught from a very, very young age. You do exactly what your husband or your father says. You don't question it, because if you do, you're going against the Lord's work, unquote. This intense brainwashing, which is Mary's own term, by the way, is what keeps the Kingston Group's rank and file in line, even as the leaders enjoy liberties and luxuries the average member can only imagine. One striking illustration of the inequity, Mary observed that her father, himself one of the group's leaders, had ready access to all the money he wanted from the cooperative's accounts. She says he'll draw out a few $1,000s a week and he'll buy the newest Apple products, computers, and all kinds of electronics. And meanwhile, there are people out here struggling to put food on their table. The leadership caste enriches itself while preaching sacrifice to everyone else. Mary and other ex members also report that Kingston leaders explicitly encouraged some members to, quote, bleed the beast, a slang term in polygamous circles meaning to defraud government programs for the group's gain. Women, for instance, were directed to apply for public welfare, food stamps, and medical aid by claiming to be single mothers, omitting their spiritual husbands, and then funnel those benefits back to the group's coffers. They would also file fraudulent tax returns or college financial aid applications using their many children, with any illicit refunds or grants turned over to the order's business office. The mothers themselves, you think they got any money? They rarely kept a dime. Kingston officials have publicly denied bleeding the beast is an approved practice, calling the concept abhorrent and not a tenet of their faith. But mounting evidence suggests otherwise. As we'll see, even the massive biodiesel fraud scheme that ensnared some Kingstons was executed in part by enlisting teenagers to falsify documents and hide records. The pattern is clear: absolute obedience, exploitation of labor and child labor, and an ends justify the means morality regarding outsiders, including the government. This insular and self justifying culture allowed the Kingston Group to flourish in secrecy for decades. But inevitably, some secrets grew too large and some dissidents too loud for the outside world to ignore. By the 90s, those in the know whispered that the Kingston family wasn't just another polygamous clan scraping by on a rural farm. They were rich, perhaps one of the richest families in Utah. State officials at one point estimated the Kingstons' businesses and properties were worth over $100 million in the 90s and spanned over multiple states. One early investigative report in 1998 dubbed the sect Kingston Inc., Polygamy's entrepreneurial empire, describing how the family had built a financial juggernaut while maintaining a low profile. At that time, various sources pegged the Kingston holdings between $150 to $170 million. Can you even imagine? But even insiders said, quote, that was laughably low. What? The true scope of the wealth was hard to gauge precisely by design. How did a secretive religious group accumulate such wealth? Part of the answer lies in that cooperative structure we've already described. When you can compel hundreds of people to work for token wages and reinvest all profits into the group, capital can snowball very quickly. But you don't get any ideas, okay? Do not do this. But also, leadership diversified into a myriad of industries. In Salt Lake County alone, public records in the late 90s showed that at least 48 businesses linked to Kingston family members, from vending machine suppliers to real estate holding companies, had amassed this fortune. The family had interests in restaurants, retail stores, pawn shops, farms, factories, mines, and a host of service companies. Importantly, many Kingstons became involved in mining and energy, which proved incredibly lucrative. The clan acquired a coal mine in Huntington, Utah, often referred to as the Co-op Mine or CW Mining. At one point, this coal operation was reportedly bringing in $1 million a month. A month. A month. They also dabbled in casino-related ventures. Yeah. The fundamentalists dabbled in casino ventures. But by the way, gambling is illegal in Utah, so any casino-related interests would have been out of state. The Kingston companies, while superficially separate, they all fed the same beast. Often contracts and jobs were kept in the family. For example, the sect opened a charter school, Vanguard Academy, in 2016, funded by Utah taxpayer dollars. Soon, state officials had found that the school had been funneling its contracts to Kingston-owned businesses for supplies, services, and even curriculum, a blatant conflict of interest. When the Utah Charter School Board tried to oust Vanguard's Kingston affiliated board members in 2022, the school fought back with a lawsuit and obtained a restraining order to stop the intervention. Such maneuvers demonstrate the clan's savvy in using legal entities and litigation to try to shield their realm. Nothing in the Kingston world happens by accident. It is a highly organized enterprise. Even law enforcement came to view it that way. In the 2024 federal complaint, prosecutors flatly described the Kingston Group as a criminal enterprise masquerading as a religious sect. This suit lists 450 suspected businesses tied to the order. This is an astonishing number that only proves how thoroughly the Kingstons have embedded themselves into the economic fabric of the region. To illustrate the reach, chances are that an unsuspecting Utah has, at some point, done business with the Kingstons without ever knowing it. Maybe they bought equipment from Standard Restaurant Supply or a new cafe, or they rented a tuxedo from a shop owned by the Kingstons, or pumped gas at a co op station. The clan's strategy was to place businesses and real estate holdings under corporate titles and other names that shield the Kingston from direct scrutiny, as one investigative article noted. They intentionally kept any Kingston name off of storefronts and corporate filings. This allowed them to grow their fortune quietly, and outsiders would never realize that these diverse enterprises all trace back to one single family. And behind this vast business empire was an intense protectiveness, sometimes veering into violence. A dramatic episode from the 1970s involves the infamous polygamous leader Ervil LeBaron, a self-proclaimed prophet who led a different group and had a penchant for ordering assassinations of rivals. LeBaron believed in extorting other polygamous groups for tithing payments, essentially demanding a cut of their earnings under the threat of harm. According to Kingston lore, Ervil LeBaron targeted the Kingstons, trying to shake them down and even threatening sabotage of their businesses if they didn't pay up. The Kingstons did not take kindly to this. John Ortel Kingston himself met with LeBaron to negotiate and set up a second meeting to settle things. At that rendezvous, the Kingstons arrived armed and ready. They had men with weapons lying in wait. One source said they even had a body bag prepared. The implication was clear. If Ervil showed up, he might not leave. In the event, LeBaron never appeared at that meeting, and shortly thereafter, he became preoccupied with other enemies, and LeBaron was later captured and died in prison in 1981. But the takeaway is still striking. The Kingstons were willing to use potentially deadly force to protect their economic stewardships. As an insider put it, they were sick and tired of being harassed, and it was costing a lot to put up guards to all of that. The story, whether it embellished or not, reinforces the idea that the Kingstons saw themselves as operating outside the law's protection. They had to defend their own. For many years, the Kingston Group managed to avoid major criminal scrutiny despite their shadowy financial maneuvers. In 2016, acting on long simmering suspicions, the state of Utah and federal agents raided various Kingston properties looking for evidence of welfare fraud. Rumors had swirled that the Kingstons were bleeding the beast by having multiple polygamous wives file for single mothers to get public assistance. However, after a 2-year investigation, officials somewhat surprisingly found no wrongdoing and announced no significant fraud had been uncovered. And the Kingstons, of course, touted this as vindication, arguing that any fraud was just the work of a couple of bad actors rather than a systemic practice. In hindsight, some observers think the Kingstons were simply more sophisticated in their methods than groups like the FLDS had been. The Kingstons prided themselves on self-sufficiency and often pointed out that per capita, their members contributed more to the tax base than average citizens. Indeed, many Kingston-run businesses were legitimate and successful enterprises that paid taxes and employed non-members as well. So this blend of lawful commerce and quiet law-breaking made it tricky for authorities to pin broad charges on the organization. But that changed when a few brave insiders decided to blow the whistle on something much bigger than welfare fraud. In the early 2010s, whispers grew about an elaborate scheme involving Washakie Renewable Energy, or WRE, a biofuel company run by Kingston brothers Jacob and Isaiah Kingston. WRE had positioned itself to cash in on federal renewable fuel tax credits by claiming to produce biofuel. But investigators later revealed it was largely a sham. Washakie claimed credits on more than $1 billion worth of fuel that it didn't actually produce, in what an IRS investigator called one of the most egregious examples of tax fraud in U.S. history. The operation laundered proceeds through a maze of shell companies and overseas accounts. For a time, it made the Kingstons fabulously wealthy. Jacob Kingston bought multi-million-dollar properties, luxury cars, and even a $3.5 million 2010 Bugatti supercar as trophies of success. But cracks appeared by 2016 when federal agents raided Washaki's office. The linchpin in cracking the case was Mary Nelson, that young Kingston daughter who had daringly left the group in 2013. Mary's mother was a Kingston. Her cousins included Jacob and Isaiah, the Washaki executives. After leaving, Mary married an outsider, Brian Nelson, and in a bold move, she decided to approach the FBI with information about massive fraud that was encouraged by the group's leaders. Mary provided crucial insider details that helped the government indict Jacob and Isaiah Kingston, along with a non Kingston business partner named Lev Derman in 2018. The fraud they uncovered was staggering. Over $511 million stolen through false renewable fuel credit claims. In 2019, facing overwhelming evidence, including testimony from other insiders, Jacob and Isaiah Kingston pleaded guilty to fraud, money laundering, and other charges. Two other Kingston associates also pled guilty. In 2020, Derman was convicted at trial as the mastermind who partnered with the Kingstons. By 2023, the Kingston brothers were sentenced to federal prison and ordered to repay $511 million back to the U.S. The Justice Department called it a major takedown of an organized fraud ring. For the Kingston Group, the Washaki case was a watershed moment. It was the first time top members of the clan faced significant prison time for financial crimes. It also pulled back the curtain on the group's international dealings. The Kingstons had laundered money through Turkey, Luxembourg, and other countries as part of the scheme. And notably, evidence showed that they tried to obstruct justice. At one point, Mary Nelson learned that her Kingston cousins had hired an enforcer to intimidate or harm her and her husband for informing police. As the 2020s dawned, what was once unimaginable began to happen. Kingston survivors banded together and went on the offensive. The same year the biodiesel fraud case wrapped up, Lifetime's reality show Escaping Polygamy was gaining attention. Led by three brave sisters who had fled the Kingston Group years earlier, Jessica, Andrea, and Chanel were now using new last names. Week after week, viewers watched as these young women helped others sneak out of polygamous homes, often under the cover of night, in heart-pounding escapes. They spoke openly about the abuses in the order, the racism, the incest, the forced marriages. This all brought unprecedented public awareness. In one episode, Jessica went back to confront her father, Daniel Kingston, about why he'd force her 16-year-old self to marry and bear children so young. That confrontation, which took place in a parked car, ended with Daniel coldly dismissing her pain. A moment that crystallized to many the callousness at the top of the Kingston patriarchal chain. Empowered by such exposure, former members sought justice through the courts. In September 2022, 10 women and one man who had grown up in the order filed a groundbreaking lawsuit in Utah State Court. It accused Kingston leaders of a laundry list of horrors: child trafficking, human trafficking for labor, statutory R word, child fraud, and intentional emotional distress. The lawsuit painted a picture of a system of abuse. Teenage girls were indoctrinated from elementary school to accept plural marriage, even being taught in their private school that a girl's highest glory was to become a plural wife and bear many children. The suit alleged how incestuous marriages were arranged by top leaders to produce hundreds of children with exalted bloodlines. It cited episodes of R word aimed at forcing pregnancy, meaning that if a young bride was not immediately conceiving, some husbands would violently R-word them to ensure that they got pregnant. In one especially grotesque claim, a young woman said that after she resisted her assigned husband, sect members sent her to a behavior reform camp, and later, when she still didn't get pregnant, paid for her to undergo in vitro fertilization using group funds so that she would have a baby for her abusive husband. The group knew about the abuse, but they didn't report or stop it. The 2022 state case was a bold strike, but the plaintiffs weren't finished. They withdrew the state lawsuit in 2023 before it went to trial, only to refile an even more expansive case in federal court in early 2024. This new complaint is the RICO suite mentioned at the start of our story. Spanning 136 pages, it alleges that the Kingston Group functioned as a racketeering enterprise engaging in forced labor, trafficking of minors, kidnapping through coerced marriages and confinements, money laundering, and various forms of fraud. Nearly 50 individuals and entities are named as defendants, including 14 Kingston members, with Paul Elden Kingston being among them, and the Davis County Cooperative Society as an organization. Even the Kingston run Vanguard Academy Charter School was listed, underlining how enmeshed the alleged crimes were with ostensibly legitimate institutions. The suit chronicles stories like those of plaintiff Amanda Grant and plaintiff Jenny Kingston, a pseudonym for one of Paul Kingston's own close relatives that we've touched on. The child labor, the incestuous celestial marriages, and the beatings for disobedience. The cover ups of paternity on birth certificates, etc., etc., etc. It asserts that Kingston leaders enforced silence and compliance by any means necessary, effectively running a systemic and systematic pattern of unlawful activity designed to enrich certain order members at the expense of others, and to grow the order's ranks by pushing girls and young women to have as many children as possible. One particularly telling allegation in the suit involves birth certificates. To avoid legal scrutiny for polygamous and underage unions, Kingston fathers often did not put their own names on their child's birth certificates. Many plaintiffs discovered as adults that their listed father was a made-up person. For example, Amanda Grant found that her birth certificate named a non-existent man, Kyle Grant, as her father, a fiction that allowed her real father, Verl Johnson, who had 3 wives and 33 children, to dodge state attention for child support or bigamy. In Amanda's family, this deceit was even told as a funny story, a joke about how the government hunted for poor Kyle Grant to pay child support until they realized he wasn't the real guardian. Ha ha ha, it's so funny. Such anecdotes are examples of the brazen attitude toward defrauding or misleading outside authorities, consistent with bleeding the beast, the mentality that the order officially denies having, but clearly practiced. Meanwhile, even as this sweeping case moves through the courts, it's still ongoing to this day. Other individual legal actions have sprung up. In January 2025, a young woman named Catherine Nichols filed a federal lawsuit with an especially harrowing personal story. Catherine is a former Kingston who alleges that at age 16, she was forced by her parents and church leaders to choose between 3 of her uncles to marry, all of whom were considerably older. She ended up being given to Daniel Kingston, who was then 19, and her own uncle. And in 2021, multiple clandestine marriage ceremonies were performed in different states to try to evade Utah's laws. So this would make her Daniel's 3rd wife. The trauma she describes, essentially being trafficked into incestuous marriage, aligns with the broader patterns alleged by others. And thankfully, Catherine managed to get her marriage annulled by a Utah court in 2023. And now she's seeking damages and accountability from the group. Her case specifically names Paul E. Kingston as a defendant, along with the church and co op and her own family members who played a role. It's remarkable, but also unprecedented to see so many former Kingston members stepping forward. As recently as the early 2000s, those who left the clan often kept their nightmares to themselves or shared them only anonymously. The formation of support groups like Tapestry of Polygamy, founded in 1998 by ex-polygamous wives like Rowena Erickson, and its successor organizations has been crucial. Today, survivors such as Lou Ann Cooper, who left the Kingstons after being married off at 15, leads a nonprofit group called Hope After Polygamy, which provides scholarships and resources for those fleeing plural marriage groups. Lou Ann herself testifies to the power of these new laws and lawsuits. She believes that if Utah's current stricter marriage laws had been placed in the 90s, maybe she wouldn't have been coerced into marrying her 23-year-old cousin when she was only 15. The activism of women like her helped spur the Utah legislature in 2025 to unanimously pass SB 76, a bill that closes loopholes allowing large age gaps in marriages of 16 or 17-year-olds. But as of this video, the Kingston Group continues to operate, though certainly under much greater scrutiny. Paul Elden Kingston remains at the helm, and the cooperative's businesses still function. Some presumably hurting from the legal fallout, but others still do carry on. The group still issues public statements in response to allegations, invariably denying any wrongdoing. But these words ring hollow to a public that's heard too many first person accounts to be naive. The accumulated evidence suggests that the Kingston Group systematically subordinated the well being of its women and children to the pursuit of wealth and power by its male elders. In essence, it functioned as a closed loop system. Girls were born to become mothers of more order members, and boys were born to become workers and foot soldiers for the family businesses, and everyone was expected to surrender their individuality for the so called kingdom of God on earth. So I'll keep a close eye on this case. I cannot believe that this is an ongoing investigation. I really hope that next year, hopefully by 2027 or mid 2027, this group will be taken down and all of its businesses just destroyed. Destroyed. The amount of humans that have been negatively affected by this business. And what's scary too is like we can make a lot of change with our money. We can boycott things we don't agree with. We can not watch content that we find inflammatory. Our attention and our money holds more weight than our vote, in my opinion. So when we don't give these people we don't agree with money or attention, whether it's like an influencer that you disagree with or whatever, that ends up being us holding the power. But in this case, people don't really know these like secretive businesses that they might accidentally be supporting, and then they don't know that they're literally financially supporting a group that is forcing children to get married and R-worded and have children. I mean, where do you go from there? Honestly, I just start like my stomach just flipped. It makes me sick to my stomach to think about. It's really, really scary thinking about who you might be supporting and not even know it. And my heart goes out to every survivor, every victim of this cult. It would be so difficult to reacclimate to the outside world or acclimate at all if you've never seen it. So I'm so grateful there are brave, brave people, brave activists who have been able to create resources for survivors who are escaping, and to all of the whistleblowers who are brave enough to speak out about this dangerous group. I thank you. You are making such a difference. So everyone, if you've made it this far, please let me know what you think about this video. This I feel like needs to be a docuseries. I feel like there's so many layers we could peel back. It's like this onion, it's just so many layers. Or maybe it's a cake. I don't know. No, it's an onion because it's pretty stinky and it's gonna make you cry because I'm afraid to find out more details of what was going on behind the scenes. But anyways, you guys, thank you so much for your support of the channel. Thank you for watching. Please stay safe out there, ask questions, and always stay skeptical. I'll see you in my next video very soon. Thanks so much, y'all. Bye.